Hello and welcome to the October 7th edition of the DRF Players Podcast. I'm Mike Hogan here in the studios in New York City, joined via Skype by Mr. Peter Thomas Fornatel in London in his little flat for the rest of the year. Welcome, Pete.
Thank you, sir. Great to be back on the show. Nice to be in the host, not in the host seat, but in the guest seat for this one. Very, very good stuff.
That's okay. It's just the two of us, so it's probably going to be a little bit more of a free-flowing conversation. Because as a host, you know, I'm probably second fiddle to you. So we'll just kind of, spitball a little bit about what we saw over the weekend and how those races are likely to affect what we're going to see in the Breeders' Cup in a few weeks. So we'll start with you because there were some big races that happened in France over the weekend, and you got to see them in person. So, of course, the Arc was the main stage, but there's some other interesting races, too, that could affect some of the horses that might target coming over to the BC. So what was your biggest takeaway from Sunday's racing?
Well, it was a great day to be at Longchamp. The weather was nice. It got a little cool through the day, but it was really beautiful early on, and found a really nice spot past the wire. But what was great about the spot where we were right in front of a big screen, and we got to see every horse come out on his or her way to the start, and then also got a pretty solid view of the finish, and then also got to see horses come back, which was something I was really interested to do, specifically in the case of Golden Horn, who, of course, won the Arc in impressive fashion. Perfect trip, loved the ground. This horse is potentially your 4 to 5 favorite for the Breeders' Cup turf, should he choose to show up there. Now, I was a little worried going in about the possibility of him being over the top already with the season he's had. He certainly put the lie to that concept with how well he won. And coming back, I was looking, I mean, he'd had a race. He wasn't ready to go run another mile and a half right then, but it wasn't that kind of thing that you sometimes see. For the one that I'll always remember is Rachel Alexandra after her amazing performance in the Woodward at Saratoga. We were in a great view in our seats to see her come back, and you kind of knew, I mean, wobbly on her feet after that effort. You knew you weren't going to see her again that year. And not necessarily the case with Golden Horn. He came back with a little bit of spring in his step. And, I'm going to be very curious. It'll be a great, great story if he comes over to have an Arc winner and possibly an Arc second and maybe even other horses out of the race coming for the Breeders' Cup turf. I sure hope it happens. Mm-hmm. Golden Horn, for a horse that I was trying to beat in the Arc and thinking maybe he was over the top then, I don't know if he's one I can land on at a tiny, tiny number in the Breeders' Cup turf, maybe more of a defensive use for me. But certainly has earned the idea of him being an even money favorite. Did you get a chance to see at least the stretch drive of the Arc?
I did. I actually happened to turn it on right when the stretch run was happening. So I saw probably the last couple hundred yards of the race, and certainly he looked like I don't know what happened prior to it, and I haven't had a chance to watch the replay, but he certainly looked like the best horse, at least the one that was finishing on that ground. I know it was a little firmer than what they're normally used to seeing for the Arc. And if you want to give an excuse to Trev, maybe you could say that wasn't really her best surface, and it didn't seem, from what I saw, it didn't seem like there was really anybody that was making up any ground late.
Yeah, I don't think the pace was that strong, and Golden Horn did get a great run. I'll say this about Trev. She was very keen coming by us on the way out to post. Now, granted, last year she just about half boiled over and still managed to win. This was clearly a harder Arc than the two that she'd won. But, I mean, what a great filly. She tried. She did her best on ground that wasn't her best. She got a nice hand from the crowd on the way back, and I really appreciated that. Great career, and a cool horse who it simply was not. Two others that are worthy of talking about with an eye towards possibly the Breeders' Cup turf, our old pal Flincher, who was so good at Saratoga. We know he loves American racing. It seems like they started training him a little more aggressively before the Saratoga race, making sure he was a little closer to the pace. He doesn't have that short burst of speed necessarily that a lot of Europeans have, but what he has is a high cruising speed and the ability to stay on and be strong and sort of, grind it out, but not necessarily grind it out in a way that suggests a horse who's too slow. He's very interesting. He's trading over here around 5-2 for the Breeders' Cup. That's a little more interesting to me than the 4-5 currently available on Golden Horn. But I'm hoping, we'll have to see what happens in the prices. But he's an interesting one. The other one to talk about is Free Eagle. Free Eagle's now had 2 pretty tough trips in a row. Golden Horn sawed him off last time. That was the Irish champion in a race where Golden Horn would have come down in the United States. I have almost no doubt in my mind with what the rules are over here. Stayed unaltered. But Free Eagle had trouble again this time. Trev ended up leaning all over him as they were making the final run, and he got interfered with. I don't think he was going to threaten Golden Horn, but I do think that a better placing, a third or a second, was absolutely within the realm of possibility. And he's maybe one at a price that's the one who could be interesting for me in the Breeders' Cup Turf should Connections choose to head that way.
Sure. Well, it'll be interesting, and like you said, it all comes down to price and who ends up showing up. And with the travel and at a short price, I might be inclined to think like you and maybe only use Golden Horn defensively. But it all depends on who's showing up, and of course what your opinions are in the intervening legs if you're thinking about using in the multis. All right. Well, we had some other races too that you think could possibly affect the Breeders' Cup outcome. What was your other thoughts from Sunday at Longchamp?
Well, the one that we have to talk about is Make Believe in the Ferret. There's some BC talk about him, and he'll be dangerous if he goes. He's got some speed. He's a handy type. This was his first start since June, so I think that he's eligible to move forward. He'd be a huge contender if he goes. He's available at 9-2 over here. So that's one to take a look at. And then the winner of the Prix de l'Opera, I'm having actually a brain freeze and spacing on the horse's name, which is terrible because I actually rode the Eurostar back from Paris with this part of this horse's owners. It's a horse owned in partnership. The partnership name, we'll see if my brain can remember that. It's the FOMO partnership. And I didn't know what to make of this. I'm sitting on the Eurostar and somebody walks by with a giant trophy. And I'm thinking to myself, is there some sort of rugby tournament or something going on, or there has to be a story here. And I noticed that the guy who was holding the trophy was wearing a Breeders' Cup T-shirt. And I said, wait a second, this has to be related to the events of Sunday. And sure enough, these folks were part of the ownership group that owns Covert Love. That's the name that I've been searching for since I started this little and but then I was doing a little research. I was trying to put 2 and 2 together. Breeders' Cup T-shirt, the Prix de l'Opera trophy. But I read some quotes from trainer Hugo Palmer, who is interested in the Breeders' Cup for this horse, but is also interested in a campaign next year, and specifically said, well, maybe we're more likely for Santa Anita next year than Keeneland this year. But still, a filly obviously against the boys in the mile, that's not overcomeable, but could be a little bit interesting, worth paying attention to and following the news. My only other note on that race was a musical one. The second in the race was a filly named Jazzy Top, whose dam also won the opera. She was named ZZ Top. So I had to throw that in there.
Nice. Well, I love it whenever we can get a ZZ Top reference in. So you mentioned fillies in the mile. We'll kind of get into that a little later. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can see my desk is spread out with a whole bunch of charts from the weekend, because there was a lot of races that happened over here that I think are likely to affect and definitely going to affect what we see at Keeneland on Breeders' Cup on both of the Breeders' Cup days. We're going to start in Belmont on Saturday. Of course, we had a lot of big races on Saturday that you can go a lot of different ways. Let's start with the Kelso, because that's kind of a key race in the sense of you've got horses that conceivably could go to 3 different Breeders' Cup races. Appealing Tail wins it with a front-end run. I think they're probably leaning BC Mile with Dirt Mile with him. But you know, if he were your horse, I guess you could also make a case that he might be a player in the BC Sprint. What was your take on the Kelso, and of course the big story also being Honor Code's hard ridden third?
Well, hard ridden, I'm not sure if I exactly agree with, but I'll get to Honor Code in a minute.
It was not an easy prep.
He's very good. I think it was exactly what he needed, but like I said, we'll get to him in a minute.
Okay.
Appealing Tail won with a 108 fire speed figure. The horse the form looks great, but I also think he's quickly become one of the most flow-aided horses that I can remember seeing. Though there's another one who you might make that claim about. We're going to be talking about a little later in the show. But I just don't know. I would be opposed in the sprint for sure. The mile, you know, that's such a weak race that anything's possible. I mean, again, I guess I say it's a weak race. It all depends who shows up. But there's a scenario where even with my cynical view of Appealing Tail sort of generally, that you'd have to have him as a standout in the mile, just depending on how things shake out. But the big note for me here is Honor Code. I mean, Shug came in saying, you know, it was like, we're in it to win it, but, and I think the but was the key word there, specifically noting that he doesn't like to run horses at 10 furlongs, 2 races in a row. I just think it's safe to say that he got everything he would have needed out of that race and is going to move forward off it. Absolutely right. He was asked for effort. It wasn't a jog, but like that's why I like it as a prep race, because going a distance of a mile around one turn, to me, that's just going to sharpen him up and maybe keep him from being too impossibly far back in a race like the Breeders' Cup Classic. Is he going to be good enough to contend in what is obviously an incredibly salty renewal of that race? I don't know, but at the likely prices, given that you're going to have a Beholder who's very short, you're going to have an American Pharaoh potentially microscopically short, this horse is going to be on my tickets. Absolutely.
Sure. Absolutely. You know, I won't disagree, and the sense I get is he's right at about 8-1, and at 8-1, that's fantastic value, and I think his third place finish might only even help that value. If he'd won easily, if he had won as visually impressively as he did the Met Mile, you might get half that. You might get closer to Beholder. You know, it might just help your price on Beholder, because I think it would hurt your price on Honor Code. But coming off that third place finish, especially if you can make the case like you have, that really he's going to step forward off of it, and really, and when I say hard ridden, to me what it seemed like was the effort was really to try and keep him closer to the pace earlier than he had been, say, in the Met Mile. Because if you have a situation in the Breeders' Cup Classic where, and I'm forgetting the name of the race, but it was the race at Churchill, I believe, where he was so far out of it that he almost had lost touch. He essentially lost touch with the field on the backstretch. If you have a replay of that race, he has absolutely... Yeah. He has absolutely no shot. No shot, regardless of what happens up front, to win the Breeders' Cup Classic. And so if the goal, sure, they want to win the race, but if the goal as much as anything is in a 2-turn race to make sure he's not at risk of losing touch with the field, then yeah, that was a fantastic effort and no reason why he can't be a player. As you mentioned, Appealing Tail 108 Buyer Red Vine evidently is focused on the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile as well. So the top 2 finishers from the Kelso pointing to the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile. We'll jump in a second to the Jockey Club Gold Cup because I want to hear what your thoughts are from there, especially from Tonalist winning easily. But I will tip that the word on the second place finisher Wicked Strong in that race is that they're looking to cut back and go to the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile with him. So now the Dirt Mile becomes a little bit more of an interesting race, I think.
Oh, absolutely. I'm just opposed to that race in general. I feel like it gives horsemen too much of an out between having to choose the sprint and the classic, and there's many years where it just dilutes both. I've made that point on the podcast before. I don't want to belabor it here. But that is shaping up to be an interesting race, and I'm so glad you said that because that was one of my notes to talk about out of the Jockey Club Gold Cup was how much I think I like Wicked Strong, the way he ran in there with a little bit of a cutback. Of course, the big story, though, is Tonalist. And, he's such a cool horse. I like him so much. There are many out there who think he's just a Belmont horse for course. And, they may be right. I can conjure excuses for some of the Saratoga runs. He certainly just seemed very clearly third best this year in Saratoga. And certainly the best work has come at Belmont. But if that means there's going to be a really big price on him, 15 to 1 or something in the Classic, this is a horse I could still put on my tickets because it doesn't have to be that he is just a Belmont horse. I know you can make the case, but at the right number, I'll take the other side of that. And I'm just happy because I made a promise on this podcast many months ago when he was fairly mediocre, seemingly with a very questionable ride that even John Velasquez admitted wasn't his best work back in Belmont in July. And I promised on the podcast the Tonalist was better than that. And I think we really saw evidence of it once again in the Jockey Club Gold Cup this year.
I would agree. And, Belmont horse for course might be a little extreme, but I do agree that his best work certainly has come there. And I don't know if that's a circumstance or certainly a preference to the track. But like you say, at a big price, I'm willing to find out. And my question, it all again comes back to odds, but I could see he got a 109 buyer there. I could see a world in which Tonalist is a similar price to a Keen Ice, say, in the Breeders' Cup Classic. That's good value, I think. If he's the 5th or 6th choice and you're getting 12, even 15 to 1, he could get a trip where he's sitting even in front of an honor code and gets first run on those deeper closers. I don't know if he's good enough to beat honor code. He's already shown that honor code, he's finished behind honor code a couple times now. But if you're getting twice the price, he's definitely worth including.
Yeah, I'm excited to see how he does. I've still contended that without your buddy Bayern's body check completely altering the Breeders' Cup Classic last year, Tonalist might have been the biggest beneficiary of them all, the way he was winding up and making a run and the way that race played out. So we'll have to see. I definitely give him a chance. I appreciated that you finally come around to my way of thinking on Bayern. Unfortunately, now it's too late as he's retired.
Well, look, I will say, and this is not even redboarding because I was all over Tonalist in the Breeders' Cup Classic last year. He was the one I was leaning on the most, and so if you were right that he would have been the biggest beneficiary, then I would have stood to gain from it. I think more with Bayern, my feeling with him was, he may have been aided by certain race flows and certain racetracks, and certainly by taking out the main pace rivals in the Breeders' Cup Classic. But he's one that I just begrudgingly came around to seeing as a pretty cool horse that showed he could run on a number of different surfaces at a number of different distances, and it's a little bit of a shame that we didn't get the Bayern of 2015 that we saw in 2014. But I'm glad he's retired. I'm glad he's retired healthy, and we'll see what he does as a stallion.
I want to interject that folks should check out last week's. I think it was on Tuesday, Wednesday podcast, which was Matt and Mike going over last weekend's, or the previous weekend's, Breeders' prep races. It's evergreen until the Breeders' Cup. A lot of the points you guys made in there, I think, will really help people get a jump on their Breeders' Cup handicapping. I went back and listened this morning, and it's not dated at all. It's an older podcast, but it's well worth a listen if you want to check out what Matt and Mike have to say.
Thanks, I appreciate that. Yeah, the approach, if you missed it, is essentially what we're doing today. We're looking at the recent races, but mainly looking ahead to how it affects what we see happening and who we're either excited to bet or to bet against on Breeders' Cup Friday and Saturday. So glad you said that, because it's a fun one. Hopefully we'll get a chance for all three of us to do it with your crazy schedule and his crazy schedule before Breeders' Cup. Maybe we can make that happen, but if not, you at least have the individual opinions in our discussions in these. So all right, well, that covers those charts. Let's put those away. I'll let you decide. Where do you want to go next in terms of your discussion?
I have some notes in the Flower Bowl, and I think we can do it rather quickly.
Yeah, let's do it. What was your takeaway from the Flower Bowl?
There was sort of a word out beforehand that Stephanie's Kitten was ready to fire her best race, and she certainly delivered on that with a perfect trip. Danza Cavallo apparently not going to be headed to the Breeders' Cup, but she took advantage of ground that she absolutely loved last Saturday.
Yep.
And I think she's going to show up next in the Long Island, presumably a very short price there. Be interested to see what, if anything, happens with the favored Kirby from the Flower Bowl. She just didn't seem herself, broke terribly, had a very rough trip throughout. A forgivable effort in a lot of ways based on the trip, but certainly not the kind of thing you want to see going forward into the Breeders' Cup. But this is a horse that you could forgive the effort if you start getting positive vibes out of the camp.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, Stephanie's Kitten, she looked great in that race. I've always felt, and if you use Formulator to use the filters, add turf, add route, add not firm, I've always felt that her biggest races have come on a softer or yielding turf course. So I think, as much as Danza Cavallo really loved the course, I think Stephanie's Kitten thrives in that sort of course. And if we have a similar one on Breeders' Cup Day, she is a huge player. If it's a lot harder and she's a short price, she might be one I only use defensively.
That seems like a sensible approach to her. Be very curious to hear how she's doing leading up to the Breeders' Cup as well.
Yeah, and the buyer came back 100. Solid, not eye-catching, not like one we saw on Saturday at Keeneland, who we'll get to in a second. But good enough, and certainly the kind of effort that you want to see prior to a Breeders' Cup. So. And again, for me, with Stephanie's Kitten and with all of the Americans in the filly and mare turf, it kind of comes down to who we see coming over from Europe.
Yeah, Kirby's resume was pretty impressive, and they handled her, but I think it's safe to say she didn't show her form.
Right. I would absolutely be willing, especially if it just helps my price, I would be willing to give her another shot in the Breeders' Cup. Because as much as they wanted to win the Flower Bowl, if they're pointing Breeders' Cup, the Flower Bowl is not the main goal.
Shall we move on to the Frisette here?
Let's do it. What was your take on the Frisette?
Nickname got the job done, earned a 78. Wasn't exactly an effort that screamed Breeders' Cup to me.
Nope.
Just for my own notes, one horse that I wrote some positive things about is Wit. I really liked her in Saratoga. Physically very impressive. She didn't break particularly well, like maybe half a step slow. But then I thought she got very keen and up into the bit and maybe ran her race before the real running started. I'm going to give her another chance where she shows up next. Obviously, if we're talking Breeders' Cup, the price would need to be huge. Right. And I kind of doubt they'll go to the Breeders' Cup off that effort. But she's just one that I'm not going to cross off my sort of list of horses who I like.
Yeah, I'm with you. I liked her in that spot. She ended up getting bet pretty heavily, even though she was, I think, about 4-1, even 9-2 for much of the wagering, which I guess in retrospect you could have. Yeah, she went off at 2-1, but for a lot of even in the paddock, she was 9-2. She was 4-1. You know, I don't know if there's anything to it, but you could argue maybe that was a little cold on the board as your morning line. I think she was the second choice. I think number one, She's Already was your favorite on the morning line. But yeah, I'm kind of with you. Nickname looked good. The buyer came back a little light, 78. I don't love her for the Breeders' Cup, but if she steps forward, maybe, you know, my question is for her is the distance. I'm not sure 2 turns is really going to be her future, but we'll see. There was another Belmont 2-year-old filly that ran on Sunday. I want to mention exact same connections. L&J Foxwood, the owner, Steve Asmussen, the trainer, different jockey, but I'm talking about on the 6th race at Belmont on Sunday. Inheritance wired the field and did it in, I guess you couldn't really even say I couldn't expect any more impressive performance than what I saw there.
Yeah, visually it was terrific. It may well have been against a whole lot of nothing. And I was kind of, when you see a visual effort like that from a 2-year-old, and then you're expecting them to maybe go and step up, I was kind of hoping to be wowed a little more by the number. And the number was pretty modest. But I guess as you pointed out to me when we were discussing it privately, basically the same number that was earned in the Frisette. But still, you know, to me, figure earned in graded stakes greater than figure earned breaking maiden, despite, you know, what speed figures are meant to indicate. I always take it with a little bit of a grain of salt, a little bit of analysis based on what the other factors were. So, I mean, not one that, you know, one that I'd be looking to bet against should they get ambitious and go into the Breeders' Cup, but certainly tape that's worth watching, and a filly who, if you just go by the visuals of what you saw, it might have the talent to prove me completely wrong.
Yeah, and, you know, I mean, that was only her second career start, and so if you figure there's still some upside there against, you know, you've got a legitimate favorite, a couple legitimate favorites in Songbird and Rachel's Alexandra. Not Rachel, Rachel's Valentina, rather. You know, I mean, if she's a huge price and they take a shot, you know, they've got 2, presumably, if they want to. They got 2 that they could take to the Breeders' Cup. You know, she'll be certainly the overlooked one of the 2, unless she ends up being the Puka of this year's field, coming off of a ridiculous visual effort, going from maiden to Breeders' Cup, and then is everybody's wise guy horse. But I don't know. It was the kind of effort that you like to see, and she could be one to watch going forward. In Keeneland, though,
how about the Champagne?
Well, before we do that, let's talk. And I don't know if you watched this race because it was Friday at Keeneland, but you had another 2-year-old filly, Grade 1, the Darley Alcibiades, won by Gomo for, you know, of course, the Redhams and Doug O'Neill. Won it relatively impressively. The buyer came back a 74, but it's a win in your in race, so I got to imagine that they're going to go. I don't know if you saw the race or not. Dothraki Queen, who was your second choice, coming off the win in the Pocahontas, ran a good second, was really the only one to close any ground late. Any thoughts if you watched the race at all, or you're going to play against all those on Breeders' Cup?
I watched it once. I did watch it live. I didn't review it with the intent of talking about it. And that probably speaks to my opinion of the race. You know, I wasn't like, oh, yeah, we got to make sure to talk about that one. That said, I'm not the type who's going to dismiss a whole field out of hand without full review weeks in advance of the Breeders' Cup. I'll take a longer look as we get closer. Maybe if there's a horse in there who projects to benefit from a pace scenario or something like that, I could try to get creative in a number. But nobody's leaping to the top of my head as, ooh, yeah, that's the one I want.
Yeah, I mean, the only one that I would even be considering perhaps is Dothraki Queen. She was the only one to close ground. The pace was pretty glacial, 24-1, 49-2, 114 flat. You know, and aside from Dothraki Queen, basically the horses that were 1, 2, 3 early were 1, 2, 3 late, albeit in a slightly different order. Or, well, sorry, 1, 2, 4 late, or 1, 3, 4 late rather. But you know, I mean, the other side of it is Gomo handled that field easily, and Gomo proved that she's, you know, she's not really even going to come close to sniffing Songbird if Songbird runs her race at Keeneland and on the Breeders' Cup. So it's hard for me.
Look, that one feels like a two-horse race.
Yeah, it kind of does. It kind of does. But, you know, they're 2-year-old fillies, so they can still improve quite a bit. And, you know, that's what I'm going to probably be looking for if I'm going to try and use anybody else aside from those two.
Hey, the winner last year was something like 80-1, and you tipped her on Twitter. So there you go.
Yeah, well, you know, what are you going to do? Blind squirrel's not necessarily going to find the same nut 2 years in a row. So, all right, you mentioned the Champagne. Conversely, it's sort of a counterpoint, I think, to the Alcibiades. You had a visual winner who I think was quite impressive. The figure came back nice, a 94 for Greenpoint Crusader. What was your take on that?
Well, first of all, Greenpoint Crusader, what a great Brooklyn name. You know, I gotta give props there. And he came very wide to win with a very nice figure. I mean, yeah. I'm trying to figure out the track from Belmont on Saturday, and I've kind of come back and forth. I saw plenty of evidence early in the day that the rail wasn't so hot. But then Tonalist does so much of his running on the rail, it's hard to say. But that was a race where, to me, the rail really wasn't looking good, as evidenced by Tale of Saval and Raleigh's both sort of stopping through what I thought were modest fractions. Mm-hmm. And Greenpoint Crusader out there in the 7 path or wherever it is certainly seems to make a nice run. I'm not trying to take anything away from Greenpoint Crusader. I'm just saying it's a race that confused me a little bit, and I don't know quite what to make of. And because of the big figure, you're looking at a horse who's going to get bet. So, sure. I mean, you know, obviously stamps himself as a major contender, I think. But for something's keeping me from saying, oh, yeah, we've seen the juvenile winner.
Has he made himself the favorite?
I mean, based on the figure, it's going to be close, right? I don't have that market up in front of me. Who are sort of the market leaders right now?
Nyquist coming off of that, you know, from my viewing, less than impressive or less than visually impressive effort, where it seemed like he really did not want to go a step further. He had been the favorite. I think the buyer came back somewhere in the 70s, high 70s for him, but he's undefeated, and you know, is certainly going to take a lot of the money in the wagering. But yeah, I mean, from a buyer figure standpoint, I think it's about 15 points lower than what Greenpoint Crusader did on Saturday. So that's kind of the question. You know, it depends on where the money comes and who the wise guys are all over. But it's the kind of effort he's won. I think what was his 3rd or 4th race lifetime, first race against winners, and he's bred to be really any kind. I mean, he's a half to Justin Phillip. He's by Bernardini. You know, he should stretch out to the 2 turns, no problem. And certainly in New York, we've already talked about, Matt and I talked about, I think I might have even talked about it a little bit with you, the juvenile colts and geldings haven't really shown to really be quite as good as what we've seen elsewhere. Greenpoint Crusader, I think, might be the exception.
Yeah, I think I know who the favorite is, and we're going to get to talking about him in a minute here, unless you want to segue to that race right now.
Well, one other thing I'll say before we get there. Sunny Ridge, I know our buddy Matt Bernier, he was all over them, and I think at the top of the stretch he was probably counting every bit of that 23-1. He ran a very nice race in defeat. And, you know, I mean, I'm hoping Matt keyed him in spots and maybe put some money across the board, because 16-20 to place and 9-20 to show is nothing to sniff at.
No, that's a good pick for sure. My horse that we've talked about before that I really like, I thought ran pretty well, all things considered. Yeah. Sail Ahoy, I'm not giving up on. Not necessarily what I want for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. We'll have to see what Connections decide to do. But all along, I've contended this is a horse who will improve with racing and improve going long. And if you watch the gallop out of the Champagne, where he gallops out best, he did nothing to diminish my enthusiasm for him as a horse going forward.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right. Well, let's jump to the Breeders' Futurity. I think what you're talking about when you say the favorite for the juvenile Colts race is it was number 5 in the race, but Brody's Cause, who got an 88 buyer, closed, galloped out pretty impressively, looked like the real deal, and ran down, I think, Exaggerator, who is a legitimate player himself. And after the race, they came out and said he had a little bit of an issue. I don't know if he had a cough or something, but he wasn't really 100%, and they're expecting him to run better next out. Kent DeSormo came out and said he wasn't quite right. I don't know. So if you believe that and think that you can excuse the second place finish, maybe he is able to turn the tables on Brody's Cause in the Breeders' Cup. Your thoughts on the race?
Well, Brody's Cause, incredibly impressive visually. But this is another case where I thought Keeneland on the day was playing a little bit to closers. And sometimes it can pay to take the cynical view when you see a horse as visually impressive as that. What did we say the figure came back?
88.
Okay. And so that's a strong, solid figure. I think I could be wrong, and I'm not saying I'm going to try to beat the horse with every fiber of my being, but I will say this. A lot of times when you suspect that a race flow might have been favoring horses coming from farther back, you do well to back the horses going forward who either were close to the pace there,
Sure.
like Rated R Superstar, or who made sort of the seemingly winning-looking move before getting swallowed up. And we, of course, talking about Exaggerator. So
Sure.
either of them could be interesting to me at big prices. But I'm not saying the winner was a slouch. There was a rumor going around Keeneland apparently about that horse that the penny had dropped, and that he was really ready to run a big race, and that he'd grown up considerably. And if that narrative sort of continues, that he's now arrived on the scene and this is him and he's still progressive, I think he could take a lot of money on a course that now he's proven that he can put that kind of effort in on. I think he's your favorite for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile.
Interesting. Well, one thing I'll note is in my Bet This Not That for Keeneland, I mentioned Dale Romans at Keeneland in graded stakes. Is a solid bet this. One of the things I didn't realize until after the race is, in Brody's Cause had run about 3 weeks prior, broke his maiden at Churchill, and was coming into the race off of 3 weeks. Dale Romans, when he doesn't give them when he brings them back in graded stakes at Keeneland, less than 45 days, so no layoff line in between. Even better, because anytime he brings them back with a layoff line at Keeneland, 0 for 11, none of them have hit the board. So that was something that I found after the race that was really, really notable. It's not just Romans in graded stakes at Keeneland, but it's pay attention to the layoff or the time between races as well. I'm
very curious when you do a little digging for how Brody's Cause will set up for the Classic, how the Romans numbers look. I don't know how you want to look at it. But there might be some intel there. I'm sure you'll be sharing that on Twitter and or the podcast as we get closer to the Breeders' Cup.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, the main takeaway that I had from that was, some horses and some trainers tend to thrive more off of extra time. Especially at Keeneland, if he's pointing to a certain race, he wants recency in there. He wants them to have run a race. And if they're running them off of works, and some of these were legitimate horses that didn't hit the board. They weren't all just crazy long shots. Finnegan's Wake, Silver Max, I think, a couple times in there. So I think if he's circling the race on the calendar and he hasn't had a race prior within those 45 days, at a short price, that's maybe one to be a little concerned at. On the flip side, if it's a big price and he's recently run them, you got Brody's Cause at 11 to 1. He had Dullahan at a big price. He had even a couple others, even the horses that ran in the in the race on Friday. Ma Can Do It and Put the Blame on Me. Those are both Dale Romans, 3rd and 4th at 23-1 and 21-1, coming off of short layoffs. So they can outrun their odds. That's sort of the big takeaway I have from it.
That makes sense to me. Should we loop back to the first of the prep races at Keeneland from Saturday, the TCA?
Let's do it. Well, there was one prior. I don't know if there's much that's going to come out of the race. It was rained off the turf. It was the Woodward. You had a few scratches. Amelia's Wild Ride. The Woodford. Sorry, not the Woodward. The Woodford. Amelia's Wild Ride won pretty impressively. I think they could go, if she's not BC or he's not BC eligible, they could go a couple different ways if they want to nominate the turf or the sprint, since he came back with a buyer of 102 on the dirt there. I think they probably just won't even go, and I don't know if there's anybody else in that race that's going to really be a player much in the BC.
I didn't even look at it.
Yeah, it's probably best that you don't, because the race was really marred by a horrible breakdown that we won't go too in depth into, but it's one of those races that you don't really ever like to see. So, with that in mind, let's jump to the TCA.
Excellent. Well, you got to make a case at this point that Fioretti is going to be considered among the favorites for the Filly and Mare Sprint, I would think. But to me, the main BC takeaway is I don't think that Judy Beauty, I'm not exactly going out on a limb here, don't think she's the same. Yeah, she had to wait for room. The caller made a big point of that. But I really thought that the trouble only lasted a nanosecond and the hole opened in plenty of time, and she just wasn't good enough. And so, I mean, if she were to go and be bet and be among one of the favorites in that race, she'd be one I'd be willing to take on.
So I'm going to disagree with you for a second here about Fioretti being one of the favorites, or being maybe the favorite. The buyer came back light. It was a 91. And I think that there's a lot of people that are going to make the case that Judy the Beauty needed the race and is likely to step forward off of it, which is entirely possible. But I'm kind of with you. At a short price, I'm not sure she's the same horse that we'd seen in previous years. I think now, with everything else that happened, Taurus kind of flopped as your short price favorite at Santa Anita. Stonetastic has missed a race. She's probably, if she goes, she might not be really the same form she was in last year. La Verdad, we've talked about her distance challenge of anything beyond 6 furlongs. I think your clear favorite is now cavorting.
Yeah, it would be my pick for the race if you can have a pick 3 weeks out. I just kind of meant, I didn't really mean to say, oh, she's going to be the favorite so much as just she stamped herself as a horse who has to be considered a contender. I mean, just race over the track, blah, blah, blah. I'm not saying I'm excited to bet her, but I mean, if something silly happens in the prices, if you're going to get 12 or 15 to 1, I would certainly think about using based off that recent form.
Yeah, and I mean, if sure, she seems to be improving, and another one that I thought ran well was the second place finisher, Hey Kitty Kitty Kitty, who could move forward and probably will be a little overlooked, having just lost to Fioretti. And if everybody's thinking that Judy the Beauty is going to take a nice step forward, she's run well over the track already. She could be interesting there. All right, let's. The races, the charts in front of me are dwindling. We've only got a few to cover. We can go back to Belmont for a second and talk about the Hill Prince. Actually, I'll ask you a question. Takeover Target wins, looks pretty impressive in doing that. Ran down, a nice effort in Vision Perfect. Do we see any of these horses? They're 3-year-olds, of course. This was a 3-year-old restricted race. Do we see any of these horses coming to the Breeders' Cup?
I mean, you would think somebody's going to take a shot somewhere along the line, but I think it's probably a more prudent path to look for those turf 3-year-olds at Del Mar for that restricted 3-year-old race coming up there in a few weeks after in November. But it certainly doesn't prohibit the chance of somebody taking a shot. I didn't really note up the race heavily because I wasn't thinking I was going to be interested in those horses if they did show up at the Breeders' Cup. So that answers the question in one way. But at the same time, it's horse racing. It still wouldn't surprise me if somebody wants to take a shot.
I wonder if they might cut Takeover Target back to a flat mile and take a stab at the mile. Stretching him out to the turf mile to the turf, the BC turf, seems a little ambitious, especially with what he's likely to see. But the mile, all things being equal, and we'll talk about someone who stamped herself a huge player in there off of a fantastic effort in just a second. But the mile might be a little bit of an easier spot, and I could see a horse like Takeover Target being a player in there. I don't know. It all again comes down to who's showing up and what the price.
What I just heard. I can't believe I heard the words easy spot and Breeders' Cup mile in the same sentence.
Easier spot. Easier. It's certainly, you got to admit that's going to be easier than the turf, right? Right? I
would have absolutely no interest in him in that. I think even the biggest Chad Brown fan might have to admit that he'd be up against it, against what's going to show up in there. But like I said, it's the Breeders' Cup. People take shots. And to be perfectly honest, in certain ticket constructions where I was going to be able to go close to all, I might even throw in, just out of complete deference to Chad Brown. But, I mean, I can't intellectually make the case that he has the form anywhere near to sniff getting a piece of that race.
Fair enough. The buyer came back in '96, but, I like an improving 3-year-old late in the year, especially at a big price. So, and as you mentioned, Chad Brown, it's a little in Chad we trust play. But we'll see. I don't even know if they're talking about Breeders' Cup for him. All right. There's only, I think we've got basically 3 types of races to discuss, and I'll let you pick where we go. We've got the BC Mile, which we were just talking about. We've got the BC Sprint, and then we've got the Distaff. Where do you want to go next, sir?
Let's go to, let's talk Tepin. Let's talk about the First Lady and the Breeders' Cup Mile contender.
All right. Well,
this was a. You want me to begin on this, or you want to leap in on?
Please do.
Well, once again, absolutely brilliant. A weekend when Mark Casse was winning seemingly everything in sight.
Yep.
The finish of the race is just visually, it's the kind of stuff that blows minds. She came home in 11 and change on that course, much faster than Grand Arch did later in the card. Though to be fair, he did more running early, I would say. But as impressive as she was, my gut is she's one to take on in the Breeders' Cup Mile, as she's not going to be getting the kind of setups where she's thrived this year. And by that I mean, I talked before about Appealing Tail as a horse who's done well with certain race flows. I think you can make the same point about Tepin, that when it's slow early, she finds an amazing kick late. But I worry when she goes even a little bit faster early that it takes a little bit of the starch out of her. And again, depends who shows up. But presuming we have Group 1 European turn of foot in the mile, and it's a big full field and there's pace, I just think the setup might not be what she's used to. That said, it was an awesome effort. I think she's really cool. I'd love to see her do well. And I might just even try to find a way to use her because she's so talented, but I wouldn't be pressing or making I can't see her being an A-horse for me. Let's put it that way.
Question for you. Is she your favorite, all things being equal, and from what we know about who's coming from Europe, is she your favorite for the mile?
I wouldn't think so. I mean, I'd bet Time Test over her. I'd bet, just for me, like.
No. I mean in the wagering. Is she going to go off as?
In a race like the mile, I can't make that kind of prediction a few weeks out. It's just too hard without knowing, who all's going to show and what the specifics are going to be. I mean, she'll be hammered. She'll be bet. She'll be, but will she be the favorite? That seems a little. Maybe you're right, but it just every fiber of my gambling spidey senses say run away,
Yeah.
with her as the favorite in that race.
Well,
So.
the Euros aside, of the ones we've seen race in North America, the Beyer came back 108. It's worth noting of all races that we've talked about, that's the highest Beyer on turf, and only be below, I think, the 109 from Tonalist for the whole weekend. Beyer came back 108 compared to the 103 that Grand Arch got. She's going to be facing that field, which we'll get into in a moment. You got to imagine Lee is going to go. You got to imagine the horse that beat him, who had been running in overseas. Mondeliste is probably going to go. You know, of the ones we've seen in North America, again, not knowing what's coming from Europe, I think she's the favorite. I think she's the favorite, and I'm with you. I'm willing to take a stand against her because. Look, she won really impressively. She barely even broke a sweat. They geared her down late. She won by 7. The Beyer came back huge. But she got a perfect trip, stalking a 44-1 shot, essentially the second longest shot in the field, and, you know, ran away and hid. But against the boys, against tougher, at a short price, those are the kinds of horses that I love to try and take on.
Yeah, I think that's a sensible approach. You know, I might take a look at 1,000,000 to 1 at Crowley's Law, where she shows up next. I mean, obviously, well beaten second, and I don't know what the plans are, but if they're thinking about stretching out for the filly and mare, or even as just a crazy bomb underneath more, obviously, 4th in the mile, if they decide to go that way, just another one to mention out of that race.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm with you. I'm with you. All right, let's move to the Shadwell Turf Mile. You mentioned Grand Arch won it. He got a 103. I don't know your thoughts, but for me, I thought the Pizza Man was best by far in that race.
I probably agree. And not only can you make the argument that he was best, I think you can definitely make the argument that he, you know, not unlike Honor Code, just got absolutely everything he would have needed out of that race. I'm sure connections afterwards were not lamenting that they almost won the Shadwell. I'm sure they were rubbing their hands together like this and saying, we are just what we need for the next race. Because, boy, I mean, nowhere at the quarter pole, flying home and just doing it very, it was just very impressive. I mean, just gobbling up ground, quickening like a good miler, and looked strong on the gallop out. Looked to have plenty of horse left on the gallop out. I was impressed, very impressed with the Pizza Man, and I've been critical of him in the past. And he's winning me over, so I don't know if that's good or bad at the end of the day for other people wanting to bet him. But to me, I was impressed.
To my eyes, he was the only one that was moving late in the stretch, and you know he also had a lot of questions to answer. I think that he answered definitively in that race, partly because a lot of people, similar to what we talked about with Tonalist, was even more extreme for the Pizza Man. A lot of people considered him just a horse for course at Arlington Park. He proved that he's not by that performance. And he gives you a lot of options. I mean, he's one going long. You could stretch him back out and take a shot at the turf, or you could say he's a big player. Who does he have to beat in the mile? He's got to beat Tepin. He's got to beat Lee. He's got to turn the tables on Grand Arch. He's got to beat whatever the Euros send over. And I don't see why you can't do any of that.
Well, I think you're making whatever the Euros send over sound like an afterthought when you're talking about the real contenders in the race.
Perhaps, but the reason why I say that is I haven't heard any monsters targeting the mile. Maybe I'm wrong. The ones that I've heard that are the monsters seem to be targeting the turf. So,
I mean, I've heard a bunch of different names bandied about over here in the press. I don't know, though. You know, I mean, you hear a lot of things, and then you believe it. You believe it when you see it. But Territories, Make Believe, who we talked about before, Esoterique, Time Test, who I saw at Newmarket the other week and looked like a statue of a horse in the paddock, absolutely gorgeous. These are all names that would be right at the very top of the market. I think ahead of any of the horses we've talked about for the mile, I think. Now, but let me ask you this about the Pizza Man. What is the plan? I mean, I'm talking about it like, ooh, they know exactly what they're doing. They're so happy with the prep. And I'm sure that's true. But I realized, are they talking turf or are they talking mile?
I don't know. I really don't know. I'm sure we'll find that out in the coming days. And maybe they've already come out and said, I have to think with the mile as the prep on the same surface, they got to be leaning towards the mile. But you never know. I mean, he's proven, at least at Arlington, he's proven he can win it longer. So,
yeah, it could be, that race could be an ideal prep race no matter which way they go. In a Breeders' Cup mile that will presumably have even more pace, with that late kick he showed at a mile, he'd be a contender there. But that might have also sharpened him up nice to make a big run in the turf. So I'm very curious to keep reading the coverage on DRF.com. I would imagine even in the next few days we might hear a little bit of word about what connections are thinking with that one.
All right, I agree. A couple other quick races to cover. We won't even really mention the Bourbon. I mean, I think Aeroforce stamped himself as a player in the 2-year-old turf, but you know, I don't know if there's a whole lot more to say, and I haven't gone in depth in terms of who he's likely to face. So we'll just say he won impressively. Another Marcassi winner. Beyer came back in 80. But from there, let's jump to a couple other races.
You want to talk Run Happy real quick?
Sorry, go ahead. I missed you.
You want to talk about Run Happy and the Phoenix real quick?
I want to talk about Run Happy as well as Wild Dude and them looking to the BC Sprint. And then I also want to talk about the BC Distaff. So let's talk Run Happy. A 104 in winning the Phoenix on Friday. And aside from the fact that he won, the race was a disaster. A disaster. And I mean that in the best possible way. If you have a horse who really, I mean, if I told you he's going to break last, the saddle, he's going to rush up in a graded stakes against the champion sprinter, as well as some other good horses. He's going to rush up on the rail. The saddle is going to slip. I would say, oh my God, complete disaster. All of that happened, and he still won. He still won by open lengths.
Yeah, it was amazing. It was an amazing effort. I mean, that horse is so cool. I was worried watching it the first time when he's getting out in the stretch. He actually looked a little tired coming back at Saratoga, and I was hesitant to know what to make of him here. And then when I first saw him getting out in the stretch, I was like, ooh, I don't know. Maybe he's, you know, a little tired. Then you hear the saddle slip, and it's like, oh my gosh, this horse is just an absolute stone cold freak.
Yeah, right. I mean, so yeah, the Beyer regressed to a 104, but considering how disastrous that race was, it couldn't have been any more impressive in my mind. And you know, Maria Burrell, the trainer, tweeted out that Trackus had let her know that his peak speed of 46 and change miles per hour is the fastest peak speed they've ever tracked. So think about that for a second. Think about that for a second. I mean, complete freak here. So let me ask you, Private Zone is now, they've come out and said they're leaning BC Sprint. Who is your favorite? Who is your more likely winner of just those two, all things being equal?
All right, that's a fair question. I'm going to go with Private Zone as a horse I've always liked. You know, I know there's some questions about him if he can rate or if he just needs to go and what that's going to look like at 6 furlongs against a group that's salty. I understand there's questions, and I'm certainly not committing to betting him, but I gotta remember what I saw coming back from the King's Bishop, and I just gotta think another huge effort from Run Happy, as cool as he is. That for me, I want my money with Private Zone. In terms of what they're going to bet, I'm much better at that when I'm looking at PPs. But yeah. I mean, you would think they're going to be close, right? I mean, you're going to be close in the wagering.
I would think, and maybe off that effort, I could see even Run Happy being your favorite. I will say this: I mean, as much of a freak as he is, he's got to break better. He's got to break more like he broke in the King's Bishop. He's got to break better. And he can't have the saddle slip. You can't have these issues You know, I mean, it's one thing. Granted, he handled work all week, you know, but from there, you know, he's not going to be running against Nate's Mineshaft and Bump Start and Gentleman's Bet. You know, he's going to be running against some legitimate horses that, you know, he can't get away with all of that stuff. So, but that said, if he gets a good break and all goes well, I think he's your winner.
I can't really argue too much with you. I just, I just gave you my gut response before. It's not a horse I'm looking to throw out completely or anything, but I just, I wonder if he's won at a short price, facing yet another, third successive toughest test of life. If
right.
you know how that catches up with horses.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's a very cool story. Maria Burrell has very few horses. You know, she's got a freak in this one from James Mattress McInvale. And, you know, she's also a staunch non-Lasix. You know, she doesn't believe in Lasix if the horse doesn't need it. So the horse has not run with Lasix under her care. You know, just kind of a cool story. One other race I want to talk about that affects the BC Sprint. It was on Sunday. I don't know if you watched it at Santa Anita. It was the Santa Anita Sprint Championship. Masochistic, your 3 to 5 favorite, finished off the board. No bridge jump. Finished fourth. Dueled with Distinctive Passion early on. It set it up for Wild Dude to win. And, of course, Kobe's back with his huge late run after. We talk about bad breaks. Kobe's back is probably 1 to 20. I would bridge jump Kobe's back about not breaking well in any race he runs.
Well, he took advantage, Wild Dude did, of an incredible setup to win his second Grade 1 of the season. You could certainly argue that he might be sitting on 3 Grade 1s in a row had anyone else been there to do the dirty work in his last race in the Pat O'Brien against Appealing Tale. He's another major contender for the sprint. I don't see how you can say anything else. Masochistic came in maybe looking like a sprint contender, a horse who really impressed me physically when we were out there running a contest at Santa Anita earlier this year. But now he's been beaten twice in a row at odds on. He set out too fast and ended up running his worst race since he was literally tranquilized in his debut. That's not the kind of form you're going to go to the Breeders' Cup Sprint with, I wouldn't think.
It's not. And maybe they're rethinking the sprint. But I will say 21-2, 43-4, 56-3, those are legitimate fractions. And those are fractions, I mean, if you look at the Moss Pace figures, even at Santa Anita where they're high, they were really high that race. If you can forgive him that effort and if he gets overlooked, he's not one I would want to overlook at a nice price in the Breeders' Cup, because he's a good one, and I would trust Ron Ellis to do what's right by the horse. Wild Dude, the buyer came back in 98. And if we want to talk about how bad Kobe's back start was, the note is hopped through his head and broke slowly. The horse never breaks, but always runs on well. If it's a complete pace meltdown, they send him.
Something Masochistic is having no chances. I was just saying I was thinking they wouldn't run, and I would concur with what you said. If it does show up, you look extra because, you would think Ellis would have the horse where he belongs, and he has shown so much talent at times.
Right, and I can certainly forgive that effort, especially if you get a huge price. All right, let's move on to the last race of the weekend. That would be on Sunday. The Juddmonte Spinster Got Lucky, I think, is aptly named in that race because she absolutely got the race set up that she needed in order to win. What was your take?
That doesn't sound wrong. I didn't. This was another one I did not make notes to talk about, but I did see, and my gut is telling me that we're going to be pretty much in agreement on it. Who's the one you want to take out of the Spinster?
Well, I mean, if you're all things being equal, if you're talking about the way the race was won, it's Yahilwa, who dueled early with your Kentucky Oaks winner, Lovely Maria, put her away, then had to hold off the last year's champion in Untappable, and was only beaten a neck and a head for first in a race that really set it up for the winner. The buyer came back 98 for Got Lucky. The problem with Yahilwa is she really hasn't been able to put together good races. And prior to that huge effort, she was a little bit off form. So I don't know what we're going to see from her going forward. So similarly, Untappable, I thought ran probably arguably her best race of the year, being way too close up. I think, and I don't know if it was that she was too keen or Johnny V moved a little too early into that pace that was being set by Lovely Maria and Yahilwa. But from my viewing, if she had tucked in and sat third by a length or two and got first run at those two after they tired, she could have won that race easily, and she could be coming in as maybe even your favorite for the Breeders' Cup. I think she's still one of your favorites in the distaff. It's really a wide open race, assuming Beholder doesn't go there, because you've got her, you've got Wedding Toast, you've got the 3-year-olds in Stellar Wind, I'm a Chatterbox, and Carolina. You've got Stop Charging Maria. There's a lot of ways you can go there, and I could make a case for any of them. And for me, it's going to come down to price.
Well, I need to watch that race again and talk about it intelligently at some point as we get closer to the Breeders' Cup. But your analysis sounds astute to me, and I'm going to definitely take note when I watch the replay again of how you saw it. It sounds right on the money.
All right. Well, it's been a fun one. I don't know if there's anything else to talk about, to cover. Is there anything you wanted to touch on before we send it home for the day?
No, I'm excited to be going out to Newmarket this weekend on Friday and Saturday. My friends at the Jockey Club over here have arranged a little tour that Susan, Perrin, and I are going to go on Saturday morning, where we tour the National Stud and go out to the Gallops and see some workouts. That's going to be a blast. I'll offer a report on that on Twitter or maybe next week on the podcast. But other than that, I'm all right. You got anything coming up that you want to plug? Any Bet This, Not That's? Any webinars?
We're going to be doing a webinar soon. It's not scheduled yet, but it's one that's kind of an interesting one. It's how to get more out of your DRF Plus subscription. It's more than just, of course, as you know, more than just the articles. It's all the other tools that you have access to, even outside of the PPs, either as an addendum to your PPs or even to allow you to make an intelligent wager even without buying the PPs. So that'll be a fun one. Look for that maybe in the next week or two. And then coming up prior to the Breeders' Cup, I plan on doing a number of webinars. It's all TBD, nothing scheduled yet, but there should be some fun ones, and we may even get some big names for them. So,
I love it. Well, let me know if I can help out in any way, shape, or form with that stuff. I'm sure we'll be tweeting around links when folks can sign up for the Get More Out of Your DRF Plus webinar. We'll send that around so everybody can join us, ask questions, etc. But
as always,
other than that, Peter Thomas Fornatale for Mike Hogan. Until the next time, may you win all your photos.